Welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi here again with Jimmy Akin, and today I'm facing my fears. I'm going to read The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, a book that I have never read, if you can believe that. I've been doing apologetics for a long time, and I've never read it. There's a reason for that. I've heard really not so great things about it. It just seemed like there were other better books from better atheist philosophers, which I don't even think Richard would qualify himself, or Dr. Dawkins. I don't think he'd qualify himself as a philosopher, but he did nevertheless evolutionary biologist, but he nevertheless did write this book called The God Delusion, where he attempts to give some sort of case, some sort of argument that God doesn't exist, or God probably doesn't exist. And so in this stream, we're actually just going to be reading this book out loud. And I've never read this. Jimmy, fortunately for us, has read it. He's got a lot of thoughts on it. I'm going to be reading this for the first time to, I don't know, maybe some of you guys are in the same boat. You've never read this book and you're kind of curious about what it's all about, what the hype is about. So maybe this will give you kind of a taste. We're not going to read the whole book. We're going to read chapter 3 in this stream, at least. The aim is to hit at least the first half of chapter 3. I can give you the subcategories of that really quickly. One sec. And something very cool about this stream is that I set up a new camera angle for you guys to follow along with the book. Let me pull it up.
Exciting.
Bam. Look at that. All right, let's see if we can get it. Okay, so see if I can get it on the screen for you guys. Ooh, this is hard on the camera. Okay. Yep, there it is. Arguments for God's existence. We're going to do Thomas Aquinas proofs. He spends, 3 pages on that. So decimates those in 3 pages. The ontological argument, another a priori arguments. 80 to 86, the argument from beauty. 86 to 87, the argument from personal experience. 87, 5 pages or so. So that's what we're going to cover today, hopefully, are those first 4 sections. We'll see how it goes. We're going to just be reading and then commenting as we go along. And Jimmy has a lot of thoughts, and I'm sure I will too. I'm sure I will too. Jimmy, is there anything else you wanted to say before we get into this? Because you've read the whole book, and like I said, I haven't read any of it besides the contents. Like I've read none of it.
Yeah, I read it a number of years ago, and for people who may not be aware, Richard Dawkins is one of the so-called 4 horsemen of atheism, and he is one of the major figures in the new atheist movement, which is not so new anymore and has kind of faded a little bit. But he's still out there. He's still kind of a peppery dude, and he, I'm sure, hasn't substantially modified his opinions from when he wrote this book. Yeah,
I mean, I do hear him say stuff like, maybe I shouldn't say that. Have you heard him make the claim recently? That, recently, who created God? Have you heard that from him?
I haven't heard that from him recently. I did watch part of an interview or an exchange he had with, and I'm blanking on her name. Her last name is Ali. She was a former Muslim who became an atheist and got to know Richard Dawkins. And then she recently, last year, became a Christian. And I saw them having an exchange that was moderated where Dawkins was saying things like, but do you really believe all this absolute nonsense? Only he didn't use the phrase absolute nonsense. If I recall correctly, he used a 2-word phrase that the initials begin with B and S. But he was dumping on core claims of Christianity and still finds them untenable in his view.
Yes. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this chapter is because, it's one of the chapters that, as I was looking through the contents, kind of interests me the most. Like I really do care about the arguments for God's existence. Like I want to know if they're not sound. I don't want to be defending them if they're not sound. Jimmy, I'm actually kind of annoyed because your accent, I'm Texan. So I'm around people with accents, but your accent is like wanting to rub off on me. Like I almost just started talking in like a country accent.
Go with the flow, dude. That's called code switching, and it's something that lots of folks do when we alter the way we're speaking depending on who we're speaking with.
Oh man, I wish I had my cowboy hat in here. I don't. I should have put it on. All right. What say ye? Let's go ahead and begin. Let's start with chapter 3. Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah. All right, let's do it. So first chapter, chapter 3, the first subsection of chapter 3. Let me pull up the special book cam for you guys.
Ooh,
look at
got
that.
a name, book cam.
I know, book cam. Okay. So chapter 3, Thomas Aquinas, proofs. All right, 77. Let me move my microphone a little bit closer so you guys can hear me as I read this out. Yeah, so the reason why I set up this, go ahead.
Yeah, well, he does have a couple of pages, in the chapter before he gets to Thomas Aquinas, so we might want to read that too.
Okay. 77. I'm good at this.
Mm-hmm.
77.
I can tell you've been practicing.
You said he has some things to say before.
Well, I guess he has less than, because I was looking at the page number for the chapter and it was 75, but it really looks like it's just a sentence or so.
Okay, yeah, there we go. All right, so this is page 77, and we're going to start here. I'm just going to start reading it out for you guys, kind of like a bedtime story. So, should I read it in an accent, or should I just
do whatever's easier? It'd probably be hard to maintain an accent throughout it, especially if you're doing his British accent.
Yeah, because it's not just a British accent. It's like Dawkins has a very unique way of speaking. Okay.
It's pretty posh.
Yes, it is. I think that's actually one of the reasons for his popularity. But okay, so let's start at the top. I would put my finger there for you guys to follow along, but hopefully this is good enough. All right. Arguments for the existence of God have been codified for centuries by theologians and supplemented by others, including purveyors of misconceived common sense. Okay. Thomas Aquinas's quotes, proofs. The 5 proofs asserted by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century don't prove anything and are easily, though I hesitate to say so, given his eminence, exposed as vacuous. The first 3 are just different ways of saying the same thing, and they can be considered together. Okay. All involve an infinite regress. The answer to a question raises a prior question, and so on ad infinitum. 1. The unmoved mover. Nothing moves without a prior mover. This leads us to a regress, from which the only escape is God. Something has to make the first move, and that's something we call God. The uncaused cause. Nothing is caused by itself. Every effect has a prior cause. And again, we are pushed back into regress. This has been terminated by a first cause, which we call God. The cosmological argument. This is allegedly the third way. There must have been a time when no physical things... There must have been a time when no physical things existed. But since physical things exist now, there must have been something non-physical to bring them into existence. And that's something we call God. Maybe we should actually kind of pause there. Hopefully you guys were able to read along.
Yeah, I was going to suggest. So what he's doing is he's trying to summarize the 5 ways that Aquinas gives. And this is very early in the Summa Theologiae. It's Article 2, Question 3. If you want to look up what Aquinas himself has to say. Question 2, Article 3, I should say. And one of the things that I immediately noticed is he's not quoting Aquinas. He's given his own summaries. And as he's doing that, he is changing terms. Now, Aquinas wouldn't have a problem with referring to the first way as the argument for motion, because he does use that term, although it's a bit misleading. What Aquinas is calling motion is not what we would think of as motion. When Aquinas says motion, what he means is change. So putting this one in modern terms, this would be an argument for an unchanging changer, who is responsible for all the change in the world. The second, he doesn't, now I don't have it in front of me at the moment, but the second way is one that Aquinas refers to using the term efficient cause. And Dawkins just totally jettisons that language and starts talking about an uncaused cause. And yeah, some people may gloss it that way, but if you want to really be true to what Aquinas is saying, you need to use his terminology. And he's not talking about causes in general. He's talking specifically about efficient causes. An efficient cause is the thing, it's one of Aristotle's 4 classical causes, and it's the thing that is responsible for how something got to be what it is. So if you have a table, its final cause may be, I can put stuff on it, so it's like I could put dinner plates on it and we could have dinner. So that would be its final cause. Its material cause is wood, or that's what most tables are made out of. But the efficient cause is the carpenter or the carpentry that makes the table. So Aquinas is talking specifically here about efficient causation, and Dawkins doesn't make that clear. Then in the third way, he characterizes it as the cosmological argument, but he's completely deviating from Aquinas' language. Aquinas refers to this as an argument from possibility and necessity. And so he talks about things that are possible to exist and things that are necessary to exist. So I guess something to be aware of is Dawkins is heavily paraphrasing Aquinas here. And that's a red flag, because if you're going to take on someone's arguments, you really need to honor the language that the person posed them in. If you jettison the author's language and start using your own language, that's a setup for a straw man. And so that's, I guess, kind of my first point about these. A second point is he's dealing with summaries, because Aquinas is not arguing these here in depth. These are just brief summary arguments, as illustrated by the name of the work they're in, the Summa Theologiae. This is a compendium or summary of theology. And so if you want to read elaborated versions of these, you need to look elsewhere, either in Aquinas' writings or in somebody else's writings. Then there's the fact, so that's, I guess, my second point, that he's picking on summaries instead of elaborated discussions. And then the third point is that these arguments are 800 years old. And so there's been a lot of work done on these arguments and the principles that underlie them in the last 800 years. And so this would kind of be like picking on, pre-Darwinian biology and criticizing it and not taking into account all the work that's been done in biology since the time of Darwin, to give an example that Dawkins might resonate with a little bit. If I took, say, Aristotelian biology and critiqued Aristotle's biology and didn't note all the work that subsequent biologists have done, he would probably say, well, you're not really being fair to biology. And I'd say the same thing here. You pick on arguments for God that are summaries that you've paraphrased, that are 800 years old, and haven't looked at what subsequent philosophers have done. You're not really being fair to philosophical theology.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add on this section, because I'm not like I haven't really studied Aquinas' arguments very deeply, so I can't I think I was even just starting to read them the other day. Like I'm much more familiar with contemporary philosophy. And it seems like he tries to address some of the more contemporary philosophy. Again, this was written in 2006, so there's been a lot of work done since 2006. But even up until that point, there's a whole lot of work that's been done since Aquinas. So I haven't really looked too deep into Aquinas, so I can't really point out any flaws here, at least yet. But I did want to say that we've already received a super chat. Go ahead and say what you'd like to say, and we'll switch to that as you're kind of finishing your thought.
Well, so I think I'm not a Thomist, so I don't have skin in this game, so to speak. But I think that Aquinas' arguments do contain principles that can be fleshed out in a rigorous way that point towards the existence of God. But I would agree with Dawkins that these short little summaries, are not fully elaborated, and you can pick holes in short little summaries that are not fully elaborated. So he would be correct in saying, there are objections you can raise to them as they are phrased here. But that doesn't really settle the question, because you're picking on short summaries, not looking at fully elaborated versions, and certainly not up-to-date ones.
Yeah, and ones that do actually cover common objections and stuff, which I know that I know this at least about Thomas Aquinas, is that he's sort of famous for going through a number of objections to the views that he's considering, and offers usually very crushing responses to them. So, I'm sure that he's probably even dealt with this objection that Dawkins is raising here. All right, let's take a super chat. This one is from someone you may know. Extra points if you give it your best Richard Dawkins impersonation. I'll try. I'm going to try. This next section.
I'll leave that one to you, Cam.
Okay, we'll see how far we can go. I haven't listened to his voice in a while, so I'm just gonna give it my best shot. Okay, but let's get back to the book. All right, let's continue. All right, so this one, we are right here. You guys can see all three. Sorry, let me start over. All three of these arguments rely upon the idea of a regress and invoke God to terminate it. I don't know if you guys can even understand me, but I'll keep going. Okay. They make the entirely unwarranted assumption that God himself is immune to the regress, even if we allow the dubious luxury of arbitrarily conjuring up a terminator to an infinite regress and giving it a name simply because we need one. There is absolutely no reason to endow that terminator with any of the properties normally ascribed to God: omnipotence, omniscience, goodness, creativity of design, to say nothing of such human attributes as listening to prayers, forgiving sins, and reading innermost thoughts. Incidentally, it has not escaped the notice of logicians that omniscience and omnipotence are mutually incompatible. If God is omniscient, he must already know how he is going to intervene to change the course of history using his omnipotence, but that means he can't change his mind about his intervention, which means he is not omnipotent. Karen Owens has captured this witty little paradox in equally engaging verse. Can omniscient God, who knows the future, find the omnipotence to change his future mind? There you go.
Okay, so we got two. Good job, and that was understandable. It was It sounded British. Could sound a little more posh, but it was recognizably British.
Okay, so, I didn't know that I was going to be critiqued by you, Jimmy, but I appreciate it.
No, I'm complimenting you. You did better than I could do. I can't do that.
Yeah, well, yeah, I was trying to go for like the inflection of like the kind of the way that he talks. Like when I listen to him, he seems very.
Yeah,
I don't know how.
And that you did really well with. I actually have not only the way I read this book was I read the audiobook, and only recently got a Kindle edition. But he and his then wife Lalla Ward, Romana too from Doctor Who, read the book together. And so he'll read part, she'll read part, and they'll go back and forth as they're doing it. So I've just heard his own voice reading this material, and you did a good job.
Okay, there you go. It's settled.
Having said that, he's got two objections here. Neither one of them deals with what he's about to get to, which is the infinite regress part. Do we really need a terminator for the infinite regress? His first objection is saying that basically you haven't proved God. Mm-hmm. And to that, Aquinas would reply in Latin, no duh. Or I suppose that would be non duh. That's what the rest of part one of the Summa Theologia is for. When you read it, Aquinas doesn't claim he's proved everything about God. He doesn't claim that this proves God's omnipotence or his omniscience or anything like that, or his goodness or anything else, just that there is some meaningful original cause that we can call God. And then Aquinas will build out all of the rest of Christian doctrine concerning God in the subsequent questions that he considers. The way the Summa Theologiae is organized, it's based in a series of questions that have nested sub-questions and so forth. And this is right at the beginning. So all he's trying to do here is prove that there's something that you could conceptualize as God. And then as you continue through the different questions, he's going to build out a Christian understanding of God and get to all those other things that Dawkins mentions. So what Dawkins is doing is isolating just the first part of Aquinas's case and criticizing it as inadequate when he ignores everything else Aquinas has to say. So that's his first objection. His second one is that omnipotence and omniscience are mutually incompatible, and he says that philosophers have noted this. Well, I'm not sure which philosophers he has in mind. I know some have, but this is not a universal conclusion among philosophers. And frankly, I think it's rather the way he phrases the objection to it is unpersuasive, because just because I know what I'm going to do doesn't mean I don't have freedom in choosing what I'm going to do. I may know that tomorrow morning I'm going to drive down to the local shopping mall. I may have made plans to do that, but that doesn't mean I didn't freely choose to decide I'm going to go to the shopping mall tomorrow morning. And so knowledge and will are two distinct faculties that can't be put in opposition to each other in that way. Just because I know what I'm going to do doesn't mean I didn't freely choose it or that I didn't have other options. Omnipotence is the ability to actualize any state of affairs that's logically possible. And God can do that and also know which states of affairs he's going to choose to actualize. So this, to me, seems to be a vacuous objection, to use a term that Dawkins uses.
Yeah, this sounds to me, because part of the reason I don't think I'm going to continue with the accent is because I was focused on doing the accent as opposed to engaging the material. So I don't think I'll continue with the accent. But
creates extra cognitive load, doesn't it?
It does. It does. So I'm trying to read back now and look at the way that he tries to argue that God, or that these two properties are incompatible. I mean, one thing you've got to do, and Richard Dawkins obviously doesn't do here, is you've got to define your terms. If you want to say that there's some sort of contradiction, especially like formally or logically. I mean, he doesn't even say philosophers here. He says, incidentally, has not escaped the notice of logicians. I don't know what that has to do with.
They're a subset of philosophers.
Yeah, but they're not experts in, or not necessarily, I'll put it that way. They're not necessarily experts in philosophy of religion. So, but that's sort of beside the point. The point, though, is that in order to argue that there's some sort of incompatibility, you at least got to define your terms. Because it seems like he wants to say that God can just perform any action. And that has long been something that philosophers who actually work in this area and try to define these terms and provide some sort of philosophical analysis of what these terms might mean, that is not one that has really been offered. So
no, Dawkins doesn't really engage it here, so I don't want to be too hard on him on it. But as I mentioned, omnipotence is classically understood as the ability to actualize any state of affairs that is logically possible, meaning it doesn't involve a logical contradiction. So there are things that you can say that amount to word salad because they have logical contradictions in them. And so God can't actualize garbage that you say that has no way to cash out in the real world, like a square circle or a four-sided triangle. You know, circles cannot have square perimeters and still be circles. Triangles cannot have four sides and still be triangles. So even though you can say things like God made a four-sided triangle or God made a square circle, that's the content of that is word salad. And so no one's claiming God can do that.
Well, yeah, I mean, this does amount to just a sort of different version of the omnipotence paradox. Can God lift a stone so heavy, or can God create a stone, can God create a stone so heavy that he couldn't lift it? And what that does, I mean, people often point out that involves a logical contradiction. If you could create a stone so heavy that you couldn't lift it, that's literally just logically impossible. It's not a thing that anyone can do, not just God. No one can do that because it's not a thing that can be done. It just involves a logically contradictory statement. And that's what it is ultimately. And the same thing I think is going to apply here, because what he says is he must already, if God is omniscient, he must already know what he's going to intervene, how he is going to intervene to change the course of history using his omnipotence. But that means he can't change his mind about his intervention, which is the same thing. Like he can't pick up the stone that he just created that was so heavy that he couldn't lift it. And it involves a contradiction. Like if you already know what you're going to do infallibly, and on that basis you can't change your mind, that's logically contradictory. It's impossible to know what you're going to do but then change your mind and do something else. That's logically impossible. No one can do that if you already have that knowledge. But the deeper question here, and this is something that people have pointed out a long time with respect to human freedom, like, do we have any free will if God knows what we're going to do in the future? Same thing is kind of being applied to, in the case of God here, like, does God have free will if he already knows what he's going to do? And people have pointed out that what this does is it confuses sort of chronological priority with logical priority. So the intuition that's happening is you think just because you have the knowledge ahead of hand, therefore that knowledge is some sort of causal, has some sort of causal connection, or it's limiting your choices. But in the case of God, that's not what's happening. What's happening is the choice is logically prior to the knowledge. So even though the chronology might be different, like maybe God even knew it from eternity past, the choice is ultimately what makes it happen. In the same way, in humans, this is maybe an analogy that could help you guys, is suppose I knew, like, if you're comparing like the best basketball team versus the worst basketball team, and they're about to face off, okay, right before maybe the off season. Okay, they just have one last game before they go to the off season. This is the number one team, and this is the very last team, and they're about to face off. And the probability that the better team is going to win is very high. You could even say, I think you have knowledge that this better team is going to win in this this game, and then let's say that they actually do end up winning this game. Would you then complain and be like, well, you said that you knew they were going to win, so therefore that, like, does that cause the team to win? No, it's completely disconnected. Like, your knowledge of some fact is disconnected from the causal structure of what's happening that's causing that fact to obtain. So there's a disconnect between what we think or what we know versus how things are sort of playing out in the world. I don't know if that makes sense, but in the case of God, what he knows is completely different from the choices that he makes. If he made some choice from eternity past and he knew that choice from eternity past, it's literally impossible for him to change his mind because he already made that choice. And so nobody can do that. If you know infallibly what you're going to do, nobody, not even God, not an omnipotent being, nobody can do that. So it involves a logical contradiction, just like the stone paradox.
Yeah, and to touch base on the stone paradox, for people who may not be familiar and with this resolution to it, and, like perhaps some atheist viewers or other people who are new to the philosophical discussion of it, in order for God to create a stone that's too heavy for him to lift, given that he has infinite lifting power, the stone would have to weigh more than what you could lift with infinite lifting power. So the stone would have to have more than infinite weight. And even though there are different kinds of infinity, God's got the highest. And so more than the highest kind of infinity is a logical contradiction. And that's why a stone like that can't exist. To touch base on the sports ball analogy that you just used, that created extra cognitive load for me because I am not an expert in sports ball. But to give a simple example that's staring us all in the face right now as YouTube viewers, I can see that Cameron Bertuzzi chose to wear a yellow shirt today. And so I know Cameron Bertuzzi chose to wear a yellow shirt today, but my knowledge of that fact does not force him to wear a yellow shirt. He chose that of his own free will. And in the same way, when God foreknows, or really from Aquinas' perspective, God's outside of time. So he just sees what we're doing in history. And we call that foreknowledge because he could reveal what he sees to us before we get up to it in time. But God's knowledge of what we freely choose to do doesn't take away our free will any more than my knowledge of Cameron choosing to wear a yellow shirt took away Cameron's free will in choosing to wear a yellow shirt. And in the same way, when it comes to God's knowledge of what he himself does, omnipotence is the ability, as we said, to actualize any logically possible state of affairs. So God can know all the different things he could do, any logically possible states of affairs he could actualize, and he knows which ones he chose. And that doesn't generate any logical inconsistency. I know all kinds of things I could do. Tomorrow morning, I could go to the mall. I could go visit a cemetery. I could go to the store. Just because I know which one I'm going to do doesn't mean that there's a conflict between my knowledge and my ability.
Mm-hmm. I think I've got another way that might help reveal that this involves a contradiction, so we shouldn't really be concerned too much about it. So what he says is if God is omniscient, he must already know how he's going to intervene to change the course of history using his omnipotence. So let's put it in these terms. Let's say God already knows that P. Okay, that P just means, P is short for proposition. So God knows that P is true, and then he wants to say, But what that means is he can't change his mind about his intervention, which means he is not omnipotent. But let's translate that. What he's basically saying is that if God knows that P, he can't change his mind because he already knows that P, and so therefore he's not omnipotent. But what he's really saying is that if God knows P, because he can't instead know not P, or that, here's another way to put it, since God can't know that P and not P at the same time, God is not omnipotent. But what that would require is that God knows a contradiction is true, and that's impossible, right? You can't, well, especially if you think that contradictions are impossible, you can't know that some contradiction is true. You can't know that it's raining outside and not raining outside at the same time. No one can know that. It's logically impossible, like explicitly logically impossible. So if God already knows what he's going to do, then that's like an established fact. And God, you can't just like add on to that. God knows that P and God knows that not P, the negation of that proposition at the same time. Like it just involves an explicit contradiction. So it's not a thing that God can do. This definitely shouldn't worry us. So unless you got anything else to add, let's go to some more super chats. All right, we got one from Shashank. Richard Dawkins, greater than Cameron, coming from an atheist who believes in Jesus.
Oh,
okay.
Well, I'm glad you're an atheist who believes. I'm glad you believe in Jesus. Would be curious to understand that worldview a little bit better and understand your opinion in this question. But maybe this live stream and others like it might encourage you to revise your opinion about Richard Dawkins greater than Cameron. We'll have to see.
I would actually love the opportunity to have a conversation with him. I think it'd be really cool. So, yeah. All right, let's move on to someone you may know. He says, your extra point, sir, and he's referring to the Richard Dawkins.
Cameron pulled it off. Yay.
Thank you so much. All right, let's continue the book. Let's continue. And we are going pretty slowly through these sections. We've already gone about 40 minutes, so we'll try to pick it up a little bit. There's too much to talk about. All right, let's go. All right, moving right along. All right, to return, here we go. To return to the infinite regress and the futility of invoking God to terminate it, it is more parsimonious to conjure up, say, a Big Bang singularity or some other physical concept as yet unknown. Calling it God is at best unhelpful and at worst perniciously misleading. Edward Lear's nonsense recipe for crumboblious cutlets invites us to procure some strips of beef and, having cut them into the smallest possible pieces, proceed to cut them still smaller, 8 or perhaps 9 times. Some regresses do reach a natural terminator. Scientists used to wonder what would happen if you could dissect, say, gold into the smallest possible pieces. Why shouldn't you cut one of those pieces in half and produce an even smaller smidgen of gold? The regress in this case is decisively terminated by the atom. The smallest possible piece of gold is a nucleus consisting of exactly 79 protons and a slightly larger number of neutrons attended by a swarm of 79 electrons. If you cut gold any further than the level of the single atom, whatever else you get is not gold. The atom provides a natural terminator to the crumboblious cutlets type of regress. It is by no means clear that God provides a natural terminator to the regress of Aquinas. That's putting it mildly, as we shall see later. Let's move on down Aquinas's list. Okay, so here he's just getting through the first 3, right? And what he's done, allegedly here, is kind of argue that God is not really necessary for the regress, if there is one, that we should think instead, like, let's kind of go back here a little bit.
What he's doing,
we should a Big Bang singularity or some other physical concept as yet unknown.
Right.
So that's
and
his alternative hypothesis.
He says calling it God is at best unhelpful and at worst perniciously misleading. And what he's thinking of there is, in terms of perniciously misleading, is if you import all of the other ideas about God, that he's omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent, and so on, which are all things Aquinas hasn't tried to prove yet. So he would be right, Dawkins would be right, that if you just reflexively import all that stuff and think you've proved everything about the Christian view of God based on these types of arguments, then yeah, that would be misleading. He also, though, says it's unhelpful. And so he's thinking there, if you don't import all of these other aspects of the Christian view of God, and you just confine yourself to a base view of a first cause, or however you want to frame it, and we're going to call that God, he thinks that's unhelpful. Well, I'd say that's debatable. It depends on what else you can prove about God. So once again, we have an issue with the fact he's just confining himself to the very first thing that Aquinas tries to prove, and is ignoring the rest of Aquinas' case for God. In terms of his comparison to the crumbublious cutlets, and to the gold atom, he's correct that there are termini for various regresses, and the atom in the case of gold is one. Now, technically, I'd quibble with his definition of what a gold atom is, because while they do have 79 protons and a slightly larger number of electrons, they don't have to have 79, a slightly higher number of neutrons. They don't have to have 79 electrons. There are ions of gold that can have different numbers of electrons, but that's just a minor scientific point, and he's a biologist, not a chemist, so we don't need to worry about that. But fundamentally, what he's trying to do is point out that there are, by appealing both to the crumbublious cutlets and to the gold atom, that there are ways that natural regresses can terminate that don't involve God. And he's right about that. But when we're talking about a single cause that's behind everything in the universe, it's a little bit more like God.
I don't really have much more to add. I did notice one thing, though, like going back to, maybe I can put it up on the screen. We'll just see how easy it is to see. Okay, so in this, moving it down a little bit. So in this, his own summary of the cosmological argument, it says, there must have been a time when no physical things existed, but since physical things exist now, there must have been something non-physical to bring them into existence, and that's something we call God. And this, I mean, all he's trying to do here.
Aquinas would disagree with that, by the way, because Aquinas is not going to say there was a time when there were no physical things. For Aquinas, time begins with the creation of the first things.
Yeah, well, my point is that even given his own summary, that seems to rule out his own option here. So he says, to return to the infinite regress and the futility of invoking God to terminate it, it is more parsimonious. Whoops, it's not in
it's in focus
here. It is more parsimonious to conjure up, say, a Big Bang singularity or some other physical concept as yet unknown. So what he's limiting his explanation pool to is physical concepts. But his own summary basically prevents that. His own summary says there must be some non-physical thing to bring them into existence. So it's odd that, given his, again, this may not be an accurate summary of what Aquinas was actually getting at, but according to his own summary, he hasn't offered a solution to it. So I thought that's what sort of occurred to me, and I find fairly interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. And I, for some reason, closed the book, so now I've got to find my place again. Okay, here we go. We're ready to go. All right, let's continue. All right, so 4, we're here now discussing the argument from degree. Here we go. We notice that things in the world differ. There are degrees of, say, goodness or perfection, but we judge these degrees only by comparison with a maximum. Humans can be both good and bad, so the maximum goodness cannot rest in us. Therefore, there must be some other maximum to set the standard for perfection, and we call that maximum God. He says that's an argument. You might as well say people vary in smelliness, but we can make the comparison only by reference to a perfect maximum of conceivable smelliness. Therefore, there must exist a preeminently pureless stinker, and we call him God. Or substitute any dimension of comparison you like and derive an equivalently fatuous conclusion.
So here's one where I have a little bit more sympathy with Dawkins. Now, I think that, so this is the fourth way, and he is, again, paraphrasing it. But I think that more work has to be done on the fourth way than the summary Aquinas gives. I think there is a valid insight here that can be used to build an argument for the existence of God, but at least in this passage, I don't think Aquinas has successfully done that. It also, from a 21st century perspective, it isn't helpful that Aquinas uses outdated science, because one of the examples he gives in the Summa is, when we talk about heat, we need some frame of reference with which to judge how hot something is. And he points to fire as that frame of reference because he says fire is the hottest thing there is. Well, okay, turns out no. We now understand, and they didn't know this in Aquinas' day. I mean, this may even be before the caloric theory of heat, when they thought that there was this kind of, if I recall correctly at this point, they thought there was this substance called phlogiston, or this is even after Aquinas' time, but the theory of what causes things to be hot was very underdeveloped in Aquinas' day. And fire is just not the hottest thing there is. Fire, we now know, is aggregate kinetic motion of molecules on a small scale. So the more the molecules vibrate, the hotter something is. And fire is a plasma where molecules have heated up to a certain point that they become detached from the substance they were originally part of, and they're sort of free floating as a kind of gas, kind of like gas. Although it's also electrically charged, and you can get hotter than that. You can, and it turns out there's no intrinsic maximum to how hot something can get, at least so far as we know. There is a minimum to how hot something can be. We call that absolute zero, where kinetic motion stops, but there's no upper limit so far as we know. And so Aquinas, he uses fire as a helpful analogy. Unfortunately, his science on this point is now outdated, so it's not as helpful as it could be, and it opens a ready objection to people who would be skeptics of this way of proving God's existence. And so I think that, yes, there's a sense in which we do use and need God as an ultimate frame of comparison for his creatures, and that God exemplifies certain qualities in the superlative degree. So he's the absolute standard of goodness, and the absolute standard of knowledge, and the absolute standard of power. And that helps establish a framework for judging the goodness, knowledge, and power of other creatures. But there's not an argument here that's constructed along those lines. So I think you can take the core insight of this way and build an argument for it, but I don't think Aquinas has done that in this passage.
Yeah, I mean, would you say that this is an accurate summary of what he argues in the fourth way?
It's in the ballpark.
Okay.
So it's not I mean, I could put on my textual critic hat and go word by word with Dawkins and Aquinas, comparing them to each other, but he's in the ballpark.
When I hear someone like Ed Fazer talking about the different arguments for God that are in Aquinas, the main one that I hear from him discuss is the argument from motion. I don't really hear him discussing this one. So it's I don't know how popular this one is nowadays. Maybe it's sort of fallen out of popularity, especially with relation to the first two ways, or the first three ways. But yeah, let's go ahead and move on.
Now, incidentally, if just to deal with one aspect of Dawkins's rebuttal, where he talks about people have different levels of smelliness, and so we would need an ultimate stinker by which to judge smelliness with. Well, okay, that's interesting, but remember that for Aquinas, God is on the superlative end of things. So it's not that God's going to be the ultimate stinker. God would be the ultimate beautiful smell. The problem is that God is not physical, and so God does not actually have a physical smell. But I agree with Dawkins that there's more work that would need to be done here. I don't consider this a successful presentation of the argument on its own.
Yeah, one thing that kind of occurred to me, and I'm debating even bringing this up because I don't know how much it's going to help people, but there's obviously a difference between good and bad, which is sort of in the moral domain, and things that are in the smelliness domain, or maybe we could put that in the aesthetic category. So some people might think that there are these moral truths that are objective. It's objectively wrong to torture infants for just the fun of it. That's objective. Everyone is obligated to avoid that. But in the case of smells, better or worse smells, maybe there is no objectivity in that realm. And so we don't need some sort of objective standard by which to judge the different smells, because it's a different kind of thing. It's in a different category. It's not objective in the way that morality is objective. And so maybe that's one way to respond to this response from Dawkins, is that these are different domains that you're discussing here, and so it's not necessarily going to do much to the argument. Cool. All right, let's move on. Moving on to way number 5, the teleological argument, or argument from design. Things in the world, especially living things, look as though they have been designed. Nothing that we know looks designed unless it is designed. Therefore, there must have been a designer, and we call him God. Aquinas himself used the analogy of an arrow moving towards a target, but a modern heat-seeking anti-aircraft missile would have suited his purpose better. Interesting. So what? A modern heat-seeking aircraft would have suited his purpose?
Just because it involves more design than an arrow does.
Okay. Well, I'm trying to figure out why. I hope he's not suggesting that Aquinas should have used that.
No, he's just saying from a modern perspective, he could have used this and it would have fit his point even better.
Okay. All right. Let's continue with his critique here, and let's I'm going to skip forward and see. Okay, so we're about to move to ontological argument pretty soon. But yeah, as you see, he's debunked Aquinas in 3 pages. Wow. The argument from design is the only one still in regular use today. Okay. And it still sounds to many like the ultimate knockdown argument. Okay. The young Darwin was impressed by it when, as a Cambridge undergraduate, he read it in William Paley's Natural Theology. Unfortunately for Paley, the mature Darwin blew it out of the water. There's probably never been a more devastating rout of popular belief by clever reasoning than Charles Darwin's destruction of the argument from design. It was so unexpected. Thanks to Darwin, it is no longer true to say that nothing that we know looks designed unless it is designed. Evolution by natural selection produces an excellent simulacrum. What's simulacrum?
Simulacrum. Mm-hmm.
Simulacrum of design, mounting prodigious heights of complexity and elegance. And among these eminences of pseudo-design are nervous systems which, among their more modest accomplishments, manifest goal-seeking behavior that even in a tiny insect resembles a sophisticated heat-seeking missile more than a simple arrow on target. I shall return to the argument from design in chapter 4.
Okay, so
this one strikes me. I have a lot of doubt, skepticism, put it that way, that this is an accurate summary of Aquinas' fifth way.
It's not bad.
Does he actually say that nothing we know looks designed unless it is designed?
Well, I can give you his exact words. So here's how Aquinas puts the fifth way.
I really hope that's not what Aquinas said.
He says the fifth way is taken from, but this is another example of Dawkins paraphrasing, because Aquinas doesn't call this the argument from design. But he says the fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end. And this is evident from their acting always or nearly always in the same way, so as to obtain the best result. Hence, it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly do they achieve their end. Now, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. So it is a version of the design argument. He basically says we see natural things in the world that lack intelligence behaving in a certain way to produce a good effect. They couldn't do that on their own. Therefore, we need to postulate a designer in nature that sets them in their assigned places and motions. I
didn't hear the quote that I was looking for. Nothing that we know looks designed unless it is designed. I didn't hear that one in there. Maybe I need to hear it back one more time. But
it's sure. So he says
we don't have to. No, we don't have to do that.
Okay. Well, the sentence is Now, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence. So he's essentially saying that unintelligent things can't be guided by their own essence or can't be guided to an intelligible end without an intelligent agent assigning them that end. So I don't know that Dawkins is being unfair to him here.
What was the next sentence that he followed that up with?
As the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer, therefore some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God.
Okay.
So in this, one of the things that he points out is that the development of evolutionary theory has shown us that sometimes an apparently unintelligent process can produce the appearance of design. And that's true. If evolution by natural selection happens, then you can have things that progress in such a way that they look like they're designed, even though there's no manifest designer in that process. And so what that's done is it shifted the area where people tend to apply the design argument. It used to be anything you see in nature, including biological nature, you could just say, oh, that looks designed. It looks like giraffes have long necks so that they can eat the high-hanging fruit, and that must be designed. God must have done that. And then various biologists started to question that, including not only Darwin, but before him, Lamarck, and said, well, wait a minute. Now, what Lamarck said is maybe what happens is there was an earlier kind of creature with a shorter neck, and they stretched their necks to reach progressively higher and higher hanging fruit, and eventually we got a giraffe. Darwin proposed it wasn't that it was random mutation followed by natural selection. But either way you go, whether you're using Lamarckian evolution or Darwinian evolution, there are mechanisms that will result in creatures growing longer necks like a giraffe. But that doesn't mean the design argument is dead just because you can propose that. In intelligent design, the proposal is that there are certain features in biology that you can't use that for, that could not evolve. Things like, irreducible complexity and things like that. These are features that we see in various organisms that the argument is they couldn't have evolved. So intelligent design people have shifted the argument away from everything in nature requires a designer to at least some things in nature require a designer, and say biologists haven't proven the contrary. Then there's a whole new field that modern cosmology opened up that Aquinas had never dreamed of, which is the construction of the universe in such a way as to allow for the existence of intelligent life. And that's something I know you've covered on this channel multiple times, Cameron. So the design argument is far from dead. And what Dawkins is essentially doing here is picking on an early version of the design argument before the development of modern science, and he's completely ignoring modern versions of the design argument.
Yeah, one deeper question that I'd have about this is, just because you can find some sort of mechanistic process, maybe I need to talk more into the mic, just because you can find some sort of mechanistic process doesn't mean that you've ruled out design. There's some very, very interesting work that's being done right now on whether or not evolution, if it's true, still nevertheless points to a designer, still points to God. There's two guys kind of working on this. Well, a lot of people are working on it. There's three people I know of off the top of my head. Seth Hart, go search for his name. Zachary Ardern, who is an evolutionary biologist. I hope that's the right title for him. Look him up, Zachary Ardern, and then, the last guy's name, he's like, I don't even know where he's from. It's slipping my mind. Rope is his last name, Rope. and he's maybe Swedish or something. That's probably not right. But anyways, the point is that there are people who are working. I've interviewed all of these guys, by the way, so you can search for it on Capturing Christianity if you guys are sort of interested in looking into this deeper. So my point would be something like, suppose that we came across a fully automated car manufacturing facility. Okay. And you could say, well, all of this is natural. Like the fact that the machines are doing all of the work, like that's natural. That's not a human that's doing the work here. So this is a fully automated process. This is all mechanistic, right? You could say that this is all natural. But then the deeper question would be, well, is there some sort of design that's at a deeper level in the whole system? Is the whole system designed by an intelligent creator? Something along those lines. So I don't know that it just because you can pinpoint some mechanistic system within creation and say, well, we've got this mechanistic system that does this one thing over here, like that does not really necessarily do away with the design, especially if there's some sort of designer that created the whole mechanistic system in the first place. So I don't know that even if he wants to say that evolution is true, which I know is his field, I don't think that does away with the design argument at all. At least in my view.
Yeah. In fact, to kind of put it a little bit simply, even if you grant that evolution with random mutation and natural selection are going to produce the appearance of design, who set up the rules that way? Why does nature work that way?
Exactly.
All it does is push the question back a step.
Right. Yeah. And if you can find some sort of mechanistic process within creation, that doesn't mean that there's no design, again, of that whole process itself. Mm-hmm. So yeah, let's move to some super chats. And then I think we're going to switch to the next subcategory, ontological arguments. All right. Some super chats. Shlama Lama says, I read an encyclopedia of converts and almost all of the atheists mention Aquinas. Why isn't Jimmy a Thomist? And will Cameron study scholasticism more? So maybe we'll start with you, Jimmy. Why aren't you a Thomist?
Well, so in part, it's going to depend on how you define Thomist. Now, I have a fundamental sympathy with Thomas's method, because what Thomas did was he was an integrator of different fields of knowledge. In his day, Aristotle had just been rediscovered in the West, and there were all these works being translated, into Latin. In Western Europe, that made a whole bunch of learning from antiquity available for the first time in a long time. And there were various people who were very skeptical of that approach. They didn't want to have anything to do with this heathen learning. That was pagan stuff. That's all demons, don't you know? And what Aquinas did was say, no, all truth is God's truth, and we don't have to be afraid of these other fields. So let's take what these other fields have to offer. We'll purify it, where it's in conflict with the Christian faith, but we'll purify it and synthesize it. And by combining the data of revelation with the data that has been produced in secular sciences, we can achieve a greater understanding of God and how he built the world. And so if that's all you mean by Thomist, well, then I would be a Thomist, because I take a synthetic approach, an open-minded approach. I don't care what someone's religion is if they're a scholar of a particular subject. I want to know, what can they teach me on that subject? And then if they have mistaken ideas because they're not a Christian, well, I can correct for that, which is what Aquinas did with Aristotle. Aristotle wasn't a Christian, and he had ideas like the eternity of the world that are not compatible with the Christian faith. And so Aquinas would correct for those, but otherwise use what is reasonable in Aquinas. And so I try to pull from all kinds of different fields. People sometimes will ask me, what did you think of the latest apologetic book? And my answer would, if I'm being honest, is I don't know, because I don't read the latest apologetics books. I'm reading physics, and I'm reading history, and I'm reading parapsychology, and I'm reading archaeology and linguistics, and I'm trying to pull in data from all of these different fields and synthesize it and push the field of apologetics further. I'm trying to expand the apologetics envelope rather than just continually repeating the same arguments that have been used for a long time. And so I have fundamental sympathy with Thomas's project, but Thomas also has commitments to various principles, many of them from Aristotle, that I'm not persuaded by. I don't know that. I mean, a lot of what Aquinas does when I read the Summa, and I do read, his writings. I read the Summa Theologiae, and I read the Summa Contra Gentiles, and I read other writings by Aquinas. He's a great starting point. But when I read a lot of what he's doing, I find myself thinking, this I understand why he's making this line of argument, but he's proceeding philosophically, and today we'd handle this question scientifically, or he'll be indebted to certain schools of thought, and he'll conclude theologically, and he'll conclude that something is or is not fitting for God to do, and just as if that settles the matter, and he's using kind of his own intuitions to determine what it is or is not fitting for God to do. And concluding that therefore that even though God, he'll say God could do otherwise, but it's fitting for God to do this, therefore that's all that happens. And I'm much more inclined to say, no, there's more mystery to God. God does a lot of things that are surprising. So I recognize God could choose. Hello, Luna. I got my sister's dog here.
That looks like my dog.
Does it?
Did we already talk about that? My dog is Australian Shepherd. She's a mini Australian.
She's a mini Australian Shepherd. Luna is. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Same dog. Wow.
Yeah.
She's the sweetest dog.
Oh, Luna is super sweet. But so I'm more inclined to say I'm comfortable with the mystery rather than concluding what God definitely does. I mean, Aquinas and I would agree on the range of things God can do. But I just don't want to say, and therefore he must do this one and only this one because I perceive it as the most fitting thing for God to do. I'm more comfortable saying I want to leave it up to God. I'd not try to box in God with my own personal human intuitions about what is most fitting for God to do. So I ultimately don't share various commitments that Aquinas has, including his metaphysics. I find his metaphysics to be significantly unpersuasive to me. So that's kind of a general sketch of why I'm not a Thomist. I use Thomas. I use him as a starting point for research. I use him as a reference point in research, but I'm ultimately not persuaded by him. I think various other figures, like, for example, John Duns Scotus, the subtle doctor. Aquinas is the angelic doctor. John Duns Scotus is the subtle doctor. On some things, I think Scotus is right, and on some things, I think Aquinas is right. And so I don't fit in a single school. I'm an Orthodox Catholic, and I don't belong to any particular school. I'm an eclecticist.
You should look into the work of Thomas Ward on the topic of Scotism. He's one of the world premier philosophers on that. Pretty awesome guy. Okay, so why doesn't Cameron study scholasticism more? The main thing
will you study it more?
Oh, will Cameron study scholasticism more? Probably not anytime soon. The reason for that is very, very similar to what Jimmy was just saying here. So I've got a couple priorities in my life. One of them is God, getting closer to God. The other one is capturing Christianity. So, well, apart from family, right? Obviously, family is going to come first. But then when it comes to work, capturing Christianity,
maybe getting closer to God. But yeah.
Well, that's what I meant. Like, obviously, God, and then family, and then work. So work, when it comes to work, like if I were to study scholasticism, it would have to be in relation to some sort of content that I was going to produce on capturing Christianity with that purpose, because it's not necessarily something that I would be drawn to or interested in just on my own. And maybe that'll change in the future. It's entirely possible. But right now, my focus is just elsewhere with the channel, looking into miracle reports, even exorcism reports and stuff recently. So I'm kind of switching. My interests are sort of shifting, not completely away from philosophical arguments, still very interested in that area, but have been kind of shifting to like more of these miracle type cases. experiential, supernatural stuff. So that whole area is very new for me. It's very interesting, and we're planning on creating a whole lot of content on that. So that's kind of where I'm at right now, and there's not a whole lot of room to study scholasticism and stuff and try to fit that in with everything that we're already doing and all the shows that we plan and stuff. Oftentimes when I plan a show, that person has written a book, and I'll need to at least have a few of the chapters in that book read, and that takes time. So it's there's just too much on my plate to be able to go to something else right now. So let's move on to super chat from Shashank. The chosen Jesus equals fake Jesus. The Da Vinci Code Jesus equals real Jesus. Okay. The chosen is a parody on Jesus. Okay.
He's being deliberately provocative there. I wonder what that symbol is, that monetary symbol.
Yeah, I'm not sure where that's from.
It looks cool.
Yeah.
Well,
thanks for the comment.
Yeah, I assume I hope that's a facetious
comment. The Da Vinci
comment,
Code Jesus is the real Jesus.
The Da Vinci Code Jesus is wildly nobody believes that in the scholarly community. Yeah,
I mean it's like obvious fiction.
Yeah,
I've read the book. The book was great. I've read obvious fiction.
It's horrendously badly written too. As you know, I'm a fan of linguistics, which is the study of language, not the same thing as individual languages, although I do study those too. But I also study the phenomenon of language. And so I remember when the Da Vinci Code was all the rage, I was hanging out on linguistics boards where you got linguists, talking about it, and they were just savage. About how it's written and
really
the ridiculous way that Dan Brown writes. If you want to see a great parody of it, let me see if I can find it right quick. It's called "Don't Make Fun of Renowned Dan Brown." It was an article in a British newspaper that was released back when one of his novels was coming out a few years ago. And it's written in a parody of the way Dan Brown himself writes. And I'll give you a little taste of it. Renowned author Dan Brown woke up in his luxurious 4-poster bed in his expensive $10 million house, and immediately he felt angry. Most people would have thought that the 48-year-old man had no reason to be angry. After all, the famous writer had a new book coming out. But that was the problem. A new book meant an inevitable attack on the rich novelist by the wealthy wordsmith's fiercest foes, the critics. Renowned author Dan Brown hated the critics. Ever since he had become one of the world's top renowned authors, they had made fun of him. And it goes on like that, and it's absolutely hilarious. So don't make fun of renowned Dan Brown.
All right, let's move on. Brian says, guys, this is awesome. Never change. Clears throat. Please persist in actualizing all conceivable potentialities inherent in your selfhoods. I don't know if that's what
will
that was
do.
Even, intended to be a Richard Dawkins accent, but I thought I would throw it in there. Thank you so much for your super chat. Out of the Echo. I'm an atheist, but I don't think evolution is a good reason to not believe in God. Also, I don't think the church should be anti-evolution. The church, the Catholic Church, is not anti-evolution.
Nope.
There's also a lot of Protestant churches that are not anti-evolution, but there are a lot of churches that are, unfortunately. So
yeah.
And evolution is not a good reason to disbelieve in God. Well, some people will want to use facts about evolution and put it into an argument from evil, which I'm actually in the beginning stages. I'm going to give you guys a little sneak peek into some things that are going on behind the scenes. I'm in the beginning stages of writing a script for a what are these things called? A
documentary?
No, not documentaries. We are working on those, but a skit. I'm going to be doing a skit. Of sort of a funny skit on a related topic. So I'm not going to spill the beans just yet. But yeah, I wanted to mention that. So let's move on. We've got a few super chats to get through. Yeah, you want to say something?
Well, I was going to say, while we're talking about behind the scenes stuff, we might want to talk about where we are in the current fundraising effort, because
yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do that.
We made a lot of progress thanks to your help. The people who watch this channel and see the value in its work. We've made a lot of progress. We need to from where we started, because we hadn't been able to fundraise for some time before that. Normal attrition led to the fall off that every nonprofit organization has to deal with. And in order to deal with it, they have to do routine ongoing fundraising. And that hadn't been happening for a variety of reasons, including Cameron had a new baby, which is, parents don't get any sleep, and it impairs your what you can get done during the day. So there were a lot of things like that prevented us from doing the normal maintenance fundraising. And so we're in catch-up mode now, and we've made a lot of progress. We need to raise an extra $4,000 a month compared to where we started, and thus far we've raised basically 3/4 of that. We're now at $3,100 a month. We need to make an additional $900. So we're 3/4 of the way there, which is awesome, but we still need your help. And so, you can become a patron on Patreon and make a pledge. If we had, just a few dozen more donors at $25 a month, that would get us there. We need to make $900. So that's 28 donors at $25 a month. Just 28 people at $25 a month, we would be done.
We've got 250 people watching right now.
Yeah. So that
and thousands more that are watching in the future.
Yeah, this is a very doable goal, but we do need to hear from you. And so to become a patron member, you can go to patreon.com/CapturingChristianity. If you prefer, we also have another service. If you're not a fan of Patreon, we have another service that you can use. It's called Donor Box. Is that right?
Donor Box. Mm-hmm. Got
Donor
both
Box.
Of those linked in the description of this video.
Yep. So right down there. And some folks want to help us out, like with super chats and stuff. And that's great. We always, try to prioritize super chats, but YouTube takes 1/3 of that. And so if you really want to help the ministry, Patreon or Donor Box are the ways you can do that. Now, we also want to reward you for your support. We have several different levels with different benefits. And why don't we go through those for folks, Cameron? If you donate any amount to the current effort, we have a special PDF that we're going to send you that synthesizes information about the reliability of the Gospels. And this is something that was prepared by a friend of the ministry a while back. He chooses to remain anonymous, but he's a friend of the ministry, and it's an exceedingly valuable resource, which is why we decided to roll it out and give it to everybody who donates at any level. If you are able to donate at the $25 a month level, we have a special book that we'd like to send you, and we're just about to put in an order for these books. So those of you who've already donated should be getting this book soon. It's Patrick Flynn's new book, The Best Argument for God. And Cameron, why don't you tell us a little bit about this book?
Yeah, I just wanted to also mention that we are about to place the order for not only the books, but also the sculptures. We'll talk about the sculptures in just a minute. So if you guys are watching this within a couple days of when it was posted, I would definitely recommend signing up, because we're about to place an order and then send those out to everyone that has signed up so far. So you definitely want to get in and support the ministry before we place that order so that you can get yours quickly. So, but this one at the $25 amount, you get the PDF and you get this book, The Best Argument for God, which Richard Dawkins did not know was going to be produced because he wrote his book in 2006. But this one draws on the latest literature, all of the newest, greatest things that have been said on the existence of God, including the arguments against the existence of God. It's such a fantastic resource.
In other words, this book covers what Richard Dawkins deliberately chose not to engage with.
But again, this is a recent, contribution. So, but this is drawing on the latest material, and it's fantastic. I think it's definitely going to increase your confidence that God exists. 100%. I can almost guarantee that. So that's at the $25 level. And then if you guys want to support at the $50 level, we're doing something special we've never done before. We've done book giveaways in the past, and new awesome books are always coming out. But this is something we've never done before. This is a sculpture based on the Shroud of Turin. Let me see if I can actually get the camera there we go to focus in on it. Yeah, so this is a sculpture. It keeps wanting to focus on my face. Come on now. There it is. Okay. Based on Shroud of Turin. We actually just did a video yesterday on the carbon dating issue about the Shroud of Turin, but this is based on the image that we find in the shroud. So you can actually see the wounds in Jesus' side here, all the wounds on his arms, on his face, and on his body. But these are all directly taken artistically from the shroud. And what we're doing is we're giving this as a 12-inch sculpture. You can hang it on your wall. You can put it on your bookshelf. And this is the reward for the at the $50 amount if you guys want to support the ministry, which obviously at that amount we would need less people to support in order to get to the break even point. So at that level, 28 divided by 2 is
14.
14. That's true. So 14 of you, that's all we would need at the $50 amount in order to bridge to get us to that break even point. And so that's what we have going on in terms of thank you gifts in return for all the support.
And one thing to know about the statue, it does come, now Cameron mentioned you can hang it on your wall, and that's because it has a feature on the back of it where you can use a hanger. So, you can put a nail and hang it on that, for example. It also is not cheap 3D printed plastic. It is,
not at all.
This is a metal sculpture. So this is substantial. I mean, you could smash peanuts with it. I mean, don't use it for that, but you could. So this is hefty, durable. It's not going to fall apart on you. And it is unique because there aren't other statues like this that are out there. And so if you're interested in having a statue like this, you can support at the $50 a month level. You will, in addition, get Pat Flynn's book, The Best Argument for the Existence of God, and you'll also get the PDF that everybody gets. So those are the three things. Everybody who donates during the current drive gets the free PDF about gospel reliability. If you then are able to donate at the $25 a month level, you also get the Pat Flynn book. And if you donate at the $50 level, you also get the Shroud of Turin statuette.
Yep. One other thing I was going to mention is that this, as you said, this is not available anywhere, the sculpture. Mm-hmm. And it's also valued at about $350. Like honestly, it probably is worth more than that with how quality it is. But that's the value of it. And so at the $50 tier, you're getting a whole lot of value. You're getting the book and the sculpture, the PDF, obviously everyone gets that, but there's a whole lot of value here that we're trying to give back to you guys in return for your support of Capturing Christianity that will help us continue to do what we're doing. We've seen since starting this fundraiser, a whole lot of growth on the channel. And I'm so excited about the future. We have so many awesome, amazing things going on. And I do need you guys to help support us in order so that we can continue doing this and creating this content. So yeah. What say you about continuing the Richard Dawkins book, or did you have anything else?
Did we have additional super chats we needed to do at the moment?
We do, but let's go ahead and continue with the book, and then we'll come back to super chats.
Okay, now this next section is quite a bit longer. He spends a lot more time with the ontological argument than he does with Aquinas.
Yeah, and let's also maybe make a couple notes on the ontological argument, what it is and what's sort of going on with the argument, the ontological argument. Yeah, he spends a few more pages on this one. The ontological argument, and he'll probably summarize this himself as well, but it's an argument that when I first encountered it, I was like, this is weird. This probably is not true. Then as I studied it more, I actually bought a book on modal logic to really understand it because a guy named Alvin Plantinga wrote this book, and he sort of developed the argument further from where it was. And he put it in this sort of modal version, which relies on possibility. So when I saw that argument, I was like, okay, this might actually be true. And then as I studied it more, I started to see some what I think are still very powerful objections to the ontological argument. So I'm still sort of on the fence about it. I'm not really sure that it can really be used as a sort of standalone argument or reason to think that God exists. This is me personally. Mm-hmm. So there's probably some that I'm going to agree with Richard Dawkins here. Now that said, there are like, it is still an open question. Like this argument has not been definitively proved, but it also has not been definitively disproved. And that's even as a result of, like, there was a article that was recently published by some friends of mine, Graham Oppie, Josh Rasmussen, and Joe Schmid. They recently updated the article on ontological arguments that's on the Stanford Encyclopedia. Mm-hmm. So you guys can go check that out if you want. But I even talked with Josh Rasmussen about this yesterday. And I was trying to get, like, what is the sort of overall sense of, like, where philosophers think this argument lands right now? What is it? Is it just, like, completely useless? Is it because Oppie and Joe were not convinced that this argument is sound or anything? And I was like, so what is the current state of this argument? And basically he was saying that it's not dead, but it does mm-hmm. need, like, people need to develop it more, and it's not dead, but it definitely needs to see some more action on it. So yeah, that's basic my thought here.
Yeah, to give just a little bit of extra background on it. So this argument was formulated by St. Anselm of Canterbury, about a century before the time of Aquinas. And he proposed a version of it that's sort of the seminal version. It's the one that kind of originated or popularized this line of thought. But he was far from the only person to explore this. About a century after Aquinas' time, John Duns Scotus had some criticisms of Anselm's version of it. And so, this is not something that all Christian thinkers are agreed upon. But then he proposed essentially another version of the ontological argument. And it's continued to be updated down to today. In the mid-20th century, the famous mathematician Kurt Gödel of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, so he's like the mathematician of the 20th century, he proposed a version of the ontological argument, and it's continued to have additional versions proposed. Personally, I think that some version of the ontological argument works. I think if you understand the concept of God as an omni-perfect being, that entails its own existence. I have not personally worked out how I would articulate it, but I think that there is a core insight in the ontological argument strategy that if you correctly understand the concept of an omniperfect being, such a being must exist. Not because I believe it, not because I've thought of it, which is kind of the route that Anselm goes, but because the concept itself of omniperfection must be instantiated. So I would have a kind of ontological argument that doesn't presuppose the existence of man. So it's not that, as Dawkins will get into, Anselm and he's wildly paraphrasing him. He's not really given what Anselm said, but Anselm had basically, if you can think of a greatest possible being, then an even greater one would be one that exists in reality. And so the concept of a greatest possible being would include real existence. And I think there's a core insight there that is valid and could be fleshed out, but I would agree with Duns Scotus and others that Anselm hasn't himself necessarily fleshed it out in a way that meets all objections.
All right, let's go ahead and continue. The book. Switch to the book cam. There it is. All right, bring it down a little bit for you guys to see. All right, arguments for God's existence fall into two main categories, the a priori and the a posteriori. Thomas Aquinas' 5 are a posteriori arguments relying upon inspection of the world. The most famous of the a priori arguments, those that rely upon pure armchair ratiocination. What is that word?
Ratiocination. That means reasoning.
Ratiocination. There you go.
It's a posh word for reasoning.
Okay. Come on, Richard. All right. Is the ontological argument proposed by St. Anselm of Canterbury in 1078 and restated in different forms by numerous philosophers ever since. An odd aspect of Anselm's argument is that it was originally addressed not to humans but to God himself in the form of a prayer. You'd think that any entity capable of listening to a prayer would need no convincing of his own existence. Okay. Owned.
He's just picking on the form that Anselm chose to write it in as a devotional exercise.
Yeah. Good one. All right. It is possible to conceive, Anselm said, of a being that which nothing greater can be conceived. Even an atheist can conceive of such a superlative being, though he would deny its existence in the real world. But, goes the argument, a being that doesn't exist in the real world is, by that very fact, less than perfect. Therefore, we have a contradiction in, hey, presto, God exists. Let me translate this infantile argument into the appropriate language, which is the language of the playground. Ooh, this is going to get good. Okay.
Hey, do you want to read? Do you want to read this one in alternating voices? I mean, you can do the first line, I'll do the second, and so forth.
Okay. Can you see it, or do you have your book?
Yeah.
Can you see it on the screen? Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll zoom in a little bit for you. Should we do this like school children?
Yeah, of course.
Bet you I can prove God exists.
Bet you can't.
Right then. Well, imagine the most perfect thing possible.
Okay, now what?
Now, is that perfect thing real? Does it exist?
No, it's only in my mind.
But if it was real, it would be even more perfect, because a really, really perfect thing would have to be better than a silly old imaginary thing. So I've proved that God exists. Ner. All atheists are fools.
And there you have it. That's his paraphrase of St. Anselm.
Got him. All right. I had my childish wiseacre. Is that right? Wiseacre?
Wiseacre, yeah.
Okay. Choose the word fools advisedly. Okay. Anselm himself quoted the first verse of Psalms 14. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. And he had the cheek to use the name fool, Latin incipiens, for his hypothetical atheist. Hence, even the fool is convinced that something exists in the understanding, at least, than which nothing greater can be conceived. For when he hears of this, he understands it, and whatever is understood exists in the understanding. And assuredly, that than which nothing greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone. For suppose it exists in the understanding alone, then it can be conceived to exist in reality, which is greater. The very idea, sorry guys, I'm trying to read this for myself, but you guys need to see. The very idea that grand conclusions could follow from such logomachist?
Well, you can say it different ways, but logomachist, yeah. It means word fighting.
Logomachist, trickery, offends me aesthetically, so I must take care to refrain from bandying words like fool. Bertrand Russell, no fool, interestingly said, it is easier to feel convinced that the ontological argument must be fallacious than it is to find out precisely where the fallacy lies. Russell
and
himself
that is a key admission by Bertrand Russell, because if you're a disbeliever, of course it's easier to feel convinced than it is to find the mistake. So what that is an implicit admission. It is actually hard to find a mistake in this argument when you see it fully fleshed out.
Which makes it a little bit odd to call it infantile.
Yep. He's going to dig himself in deeper here with Russell in this next bit.
Ooh, okay. Russell himself, as a young man, was briefly convinced by it. I remember the precise moment one day in 1894 as I was walking along Trinity Lane when I saw in a flash, or thought I saw, that the ontological argument is valid. I had gone out to buy a tin of tobacco. On my way back, I suddenly threw it up in the air and exclaimed as I caught it, "Great Scott, the ontological argument is sound!" Why, I wonder, didn't he say something? Go ahead.
Oh, well, yeah. So he this is another notable admission on his point that Bertrand Russell, who was a famous, I mean, he wrote Why I'm Not a Christian and stuff like that. He was a famous atheist by the mid 20th century. But even as a young man, he was thinking about the ontological argument and saw or thought he saw that it's valid, and and even sound. And he later admitted that it's actually hard to find the flaw in it when you understand the argument itself. He was out. Now, personally, I always buy bags of tobacco because you can get more than in a little bitty tin. But, he was out buying some pipe tobacco. He's walking home. He's got his tin, and he thinks, suddenly he sees it. It's like, wow, great Scott. It is valid. And so this is another notable admission on Dawkins's part. But now he's going to go to town on Russell and try to correct what he thinks is the flaw in Russell's approach.
Well, yeah, let's see how much smarter Dawkins is than Bertrand Russell. All right. Why, I wonder, didn't he say something like, Great Scott, the ontological argument seems to be plausible, but isn't it too good to be true that a grand truth about the cosmos should follow from a mere word game? I'd better set to work to resolve what is perhaps a paradox like those of Zeno. The Greeks had a hard time seeing through Zeno's proof that Achilles would never catch the tortoise. But they had the sense not to conclude that therefore Achilles really would fail to catch the tortoise. Instead, they called it a paradox and waited for later generations of mathematicians to explain it, with, as it turned out, the theory of infinite series converging on a limiting value. Russell himself, of course, was...
So we may want to explain that for folks who may not be familiar with Zeno's paradoxes. Zeno was a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher who proposed a number of paradoxes that involved motion, and one of them is Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles is the fastest human. He is the fleetest of foot. And a tortoise can't move nearly as fast as Achilles. So here's the paradox. You put Achilles and the tortoise in a race together, and you give the tortoise a head start, let's say 1 meter. And let's say the whole race is going to be 1 kilometer long. You've given the tortoise a 1 meter start. Okay, the firing gun goes off, and Achilles races very fast towards the tortoise and catches up to the 1 meter mark. But in the time that he's gotten to the 1 meter mark, the tortoise has moved 1 centimeter ahead. And so then Achilles covers that next centimeter. But in the time Achilles took to cover the next centimeter, the tortoise will have moved 1 millimeter ahead. And so you keep iterating this, and in Zeno's telling of the paradox, what happens is every time Achilles moves to where the tortoise was, the tortoise has moved slightly farther ahead. And so Achilles, the fleetest of foot, cannot end up catching the tortoise if the tortoise has any kind of head start. Now, that's obviously not what happens in real life, but the Greeks didn't have the mathematics to show why. And it wouldn't be until after the invention of calculus that we had a way to mathematically model what actually is going on in this situation. So that's post-Newton, post-Leibniz. And Dawkins is right. The Greeks didn't know why Achilles can catch the tortoise. They couldn't do the math for it. And so they said, well, it's a paradox. And they, in essence, left it to future mathematicians to figure out how that would work. At least all the ones who were observationists and looked at what happened in the real world, that's what they did.
Should we continue?
Yeah. Sorry, just wanted to put in a footnote there for people who might not know Achilles and the tortoise.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So Russell himself, of course, was as well qualified as anyone to understand why no tobacco tin should be thrown up in celebration of Achilles' failure to catch the tortoise. Why didn't he exercise the same caution over St. Anselm? I suspect that he was exaggeratedly fair-minded. He was an exaggeratedly fair-minded atheist, over-eager to be disillusioned if logic seemed to require it. Or perhaps the answer lies in something Russell himself wrote in 1946, long after he had rumbled the ontological argument. The real question is there anything we can think of, which, by the mere fact that we can think of it, is shown to exist outside our thought. Every philosopher would like to say yes, because a philosopher's job is to find out things about the world by thinking rather than observing. If yes is the right answer, there is a bridge from pure thought to things. If not, not. My own feeling, to the contrary, would have been an automatic, deep suspicion of any line of reasoning that reached such a significant conclusion without feeding it a single piece of data from the real world. Perhaps that indicates no more than that I am a scientist rather than a philosopher. Philosophers down the centuries have indeed taken the ontological argument seriously, both for and against. The atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie gives a particularly clear discussion in The Miracle of Theism. I mean it as a compliment when I say that you could almost define a philosopher as someone who won't take common sense for an answer. The most definitive refutations of the ontological argument are usually attributed to the philosophers David Hume and Immanuel Kant. Kant identified the trick card up Anselm's sleeve as his slippery assumption that existence is more perfect than non-existence. The American philosopher Norman Malcolm put it like this: the doctrine that existence is a perfection is remarkably queer. It makes sense, and it is true to say that my future house will be a better one if it is insulated than if it is not insulated. But what could it mean to say that it will be a better house if it exists than if it does not? Another philosopher, the Australian Douglas Gasking, made the point with his ironic proof that God does not exist. Anselm's contemporary Guanilo had suggested a somewhat similar reductio.
Actually, before we do that, I'd like to address the comment by the American philosopher Norman Malcolm about, okay, my house would be better if it was insulated than it would be more perfect if it was insulated than it was not insulated. But what would it mean to say that it would be a better house if it exists rather than it does not? I totally don't share his intuitions there. If I want a house to live in, it's better for my house to exist than not exist. So I think that's perfectly straightforward.
Yeah, I think so too. And I anticipate, I mean, so with respect to the version of the argument that I mentioned earlier, when I was talking about Alvin Plantinga, how he developed a new version of the argument, I think it was In Nature of Necessity, I think is the book that's found in. It was in the 70s. My memory on this is starting to fade, at least on these details. But I do know that he developed the argument further and developed what he calls the modal ontological argument, which sort of sidesteps these concerns that Kant raised about existence, whether it even is a predicate, meaning that is existence a property? And here, this other guy is raising the question, could existence be something that's maybe valuable at all? Is it sort of axiological? Is it value? Does it have any value? Does existence have value? So, these questions, I think, if you look at the version that Alvin Plantinga gives, these don't really seem to be interesting objections to that version of the argument. And again, I'm not even convinced that argument is true, but this just kind of seems out of date, doesn't really seem. Oh, it does look like he talks about modal logic in the next page. So maybe he does.
He's got a passing reference to it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. So we're about to get to his reductio of the ontological argument. Mm-hmm. But before we do that, let's go back to some more super chats, because we have a lot that have been sent in. All right. So some Shawshank again sends another super chat. He says, the 6th and 7th bowls of Revelation describe the nuclear apocalypse. Just read it with an open mind.
Well, I disagree, but that has to do with when I think the book of Revelation applies to in history. I'm a preterist in that I think that the majority of the text of the book of Revelation up to chapter 20 describes events at the beginning of Christian history, and that would include the bowl or vial judgments. So I think they symbolically represent the execution of God's judgment early in church history, prior to either AD 70 or prior to the Christianization of the Roman world, and that we're now living in the period known as the millennium, where the devil is not able to stop the proclamation of the gospel and thus deceive the nations for an extended period of time that's represented as 1,000 years. But that's my view. Other people obviously have other views.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I didn't know that you were a preterist.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. Well, it sounds like you're more of a partial preterist.
Oh, yeah, I'm not a pantalist. Pantalists think all biblical prophecy has been fulfilled, and that's clearly not the case.
All right, moving on. AB says, I'm a devout Catholic, and I have a degree in biology, and I concur with what Cameron's just stated. I don't know what you're referring to, unfortunately, but
glad you agree.
I too concur with what Cameron just stated. So, Mihoville P.
Hey, that is clever, Cameron. That it's tautologically clever. That's really good. It reminds me of once I was calling a dance. This is an English country dance. It's called Sapphire Sea, and it involves a move called a dolphin hay, where you have a group of 4 dancers with 3 of them facing one direction and the other one facing the other direction. And they do this kind of weave-in pattern to get back to where they started. And so in teaching the dance, I would say to the 4 dancers in a line, everyone face woman 2, who is by definition facing herself. And because her face is pointed in the direction of her face.
Yeah.
So another tautologically true thing.
All right, Mihoville P. It is interesting that Dawkins uses such ultimative language for Darwinian selection when even Darwin understood that there are many things that it doesn't explain. So he made his
sexual selection theory.
Sexual selection theory. Okay.
Yeah, which is an additional form, and it's an additional contributor to evolutionary change alongside random mutation and natural selection.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, thanks for the super chat, Mihoville. All right. Yeshua the King says, didn't catch live, but one of David Falk's Christian critique on Shroud was the body is 9 heads tall when most are 7 to 8. Can you ask your last guy about that? David Falk's critique?
David Falk he's the author of Ancient Egypt in the Bible on YouTube.
Okay. Yes, that's true. Yeah. And I've had him on before. I didn't remember his name. Maybe we can discuss that. I'm actually having him back on, Joe Marino, who we had yesterday on to talk about the Shroud of Turin, and he basically kind of refuted the carbon dating issue, or that whole thing. I mean, and Jimmy, I know that you're this isn't really an area that you're agnostic, but this isn't really an area that you've dove deep into yet. From what I understand. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you can correct me on this. Well, you just haven't produced like an episode on it yet. So
I haven't produced an episode because I need to do a lot more research than I have. I'm agnostic on whether the Shroud is genuine or not. I'm open to being persuaded by both sides.
Yeah, well, the guy that I had on yesterday, Joe Marino, I think you might be interested in watching that episode because he's got a really good book on the subject as well. But he argues that the carbon dating issue, there's a lot of flaws in the methodology. But then also the sort of biggest thing about it, the reason why he's skeptical of it is because of the location that they took of the Shroud to test it. Originally, they were going to test 3 different areas, and they ended up only testing one of the corners. And then later on, it was actually proven that there was some thread by thread interweaving repair fibers. Yeah, it was proven that those repairs were made, and then those repair fibers actually had dye on them, and that was another thing that was proven. So interesting stuff, and I think that it probably does need to be tested in other areas in order for us to have any confidence that is the correct date in the 12th or 13th century. A very fascinating subject, but I think he has convinced me that the carbon dating is not really as conclusive as a lot of people think that it is. So yeah. All right, let's move on to another super chat from AB. Good afternoon. Have either of you read Dominion by Father Ripperger? If not, I greatly recommend it. I have not. Have you?
I have it. I've read in it. I haven't read the whole thing yet. Unfortunately, he doesn't have it out in Kindle, which makes it easy for me to read stuff. So I had to get the paper. I had to get the hardback edition, and reading a 500-page hardback book requires more effort than it requires more time and effort than I often have available.
That's funny because I actually prefer I prefer like real tangible books as opposed to Kindle stuff. Because Kindle, like I even have like a separate Kindle that I can use to read, but it still is just not like putting my phone away, getting on a hard, physical copy of a book is that experience I think is just a lot better than a tablet or something. But
as they say, de gustibus non est disputandum. There's to be no disputing about tastes. I'm part of why I prefer ebooks is I'm dyslexic. And so with a Kindle, I can control the light on the page in front of me in a way that I can't with a physical book. And I can use text to speech to help pull me through the text so I don't get bogged down. And so that's a better experience for me given my own cognitive style.
Okay. And then also, can't you like change the way that the
font
letters look and all that?
Yeah.
And that probably helps too. Okay. All right. Fair enough. All right. Let's continue. And it looks like we'll really only have time, if we do have time, to get through this section. So we've only got through 2 subsections before we've got to close out
It goes pretty quick after this in this section.
Okay. All right. Well, then let's do that. We'll just get through the rest of this, and then we'll end right before we get to the next section, the argument from beauty. So let's continue. Let me pull up my book cam. All right. So here's his Reductio. The creation of the world is the most marvelous achievement imaginable. The merit of an achievement is the product of A, its intrinsic quality, and B, the ability of its creator. The greater the disability or handicap of the creator, the more impressive the achievement. The most formidable handicap for a creator would be non-existence. Okay. Therefore, if we suppose that the universe is the product of an existent creator, we can conceive of a greater being, namely one who created everything while not existing. Seems pretty contradictory. An existing God, therefore, would not be a greater being than which a greater cannot be conceived, because an even more formidable and incredible creator would be a God which did not exist. Ergo, God does not exist. Okay, this is terrible. Is this his or
No. He credits this
Douglas
to
Gasking.
the Australian Douglas Gaskin.
Okay, that's awful. There are good responses to the ontological argument. This is not one of them, in my view. All right,
no,
but that's
essentially along the lines of Ulan Khulufid's positive disproof of the existence of God based on the existence of the Babel fish in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which, as even atheist author Douglas Adams himself noted, most theologians have regarded as a pile of fetid dingo's kidneys.
Okay. Needless to say, Gasking didn't really prove that God does not exist. By the same token, Anselm didn't prove that he does. The only difference is Gasking was being funny on purpose, as he realized the existence or non-existence of God is too big a question to be decided by dialectical prestidigitation.
Means magic.
This word is too high IQ for me, unfortunately. And I don't think the slippery use of existence as an indicator of perfection is the worst of the argument's problems. I've forgotten the details, but I once piqued a gathering of theologians and philosophers by adapting the ontological argument to prove that pigs can fly. They felt the need to resort to modal logic to prove that I was wrong.
Which doesn't mean they didn't prove he was wrong.
Yeah, exactly. They felt the need to resort to modal logic. Okay. The ontological argument, like all a priori arguments for the existence of God, reminds me of the old man in Aldous Huxley's Point-Counterpoint, who discovered a mathematical proof of the existence of God. Let me zoom in here for you guys to read this one. You know the formula. M over thought equals infinity.
Not.
Oh, sorry.
Not,
over
meaning
not.
0.
Okay. Sorry, I'm actually reading off of the screen, so it's like hard for me to see this. Okay. You know the formula. M over naught equals infinity. M being any positive number. Well, why not reduce the equation to a simpler form by multiplying both sides by naught? In which case you have m equals infinity times naught. That is to say that a positive number is the product of 0 and infinity. Doesn't that demonstrate the creation of the universe by an infinite power out of nothing? Doesn't it? Okay. Any thoughts on that before you continue?
Well, what he's trying to do is propose parallel cases that he thinks are equally unsuccessful to Anselm's version of the ontological argument. So Aldous Huxley's character here is a character in a novel, and so this is not a serious argument. It also violates the laws of standard mathematics, because anything divided by zero is not infinite. It is mathematically undefined, because it will lead to logical paradoxes. And so if you actually want to use the expression m divided by zero, what you have to do is extend mathematics to explain which avenue you're going to be pursuing when you use that expression. But you can't just use the expression and conclude it equals infinity without further elaboration, because you could m can, in that expression, can have any value, and thus you could use it to show that all numbers are equal to each other, which is patently not true. So you either disallow that expression, which is what conventional mathematics does, or you extend mathematics in such a way that prevents the kind of paradoxes resulting that otherwise would result.
Well, to me, this looks like a pretty obvious case of guilt by association. So he's wanting to say that the ontological argument is part of this group of arguments, and another,
Right.
token in that group is absurd. So therefore, since the ontological argument is in that group, therefore it too is absurd, and that doesn't follow. It's a non sequitur.
That's exactly what he's doing, and he's not really engaging the argument itself. All he's done so far to engage the argument is say that there's an illegitimate move when you assume greatness conceptual greatness is going to entail actual existence. But that's the only substantive thing he said.
So let's move on to the last bit of this section. Or there is the notorious 18th century debate on the existence of God, staged by Catherine the Great between Euler, the Swiss mathematician.
It's actually Euler, but that's fine.
Euler,
Sorry, is a reflex.
Okay. The Swiss mathematician, and Diderot, the great encyclopedist of the Enlightenment. The pious Euler advanced upon the atheistic Diderot, and in tones of the most utmost conviction delivered his challenge: Monsieur, a plus b to the n divided by n equals x, therefore God exists. Reply: Diderot was cowed into withdrawal, and one version of the story was him withdrawing all the way back to France. Euler was employing what might be called the argument from blinding with science, in this case mathematics. Did you want to say something?
Oh, well, no, but I can, which is, notice that this is a legend that he's citing here. This is not a real event.
Yeah. Euler was employing what might be called the argument from blind... Oh, sorry, I read all this so far. Let me scoot down a little bit. David Mills in Atheist Universe transcribes a radio interview of himself by a religious spokesman who invoked the law of conservation of mass energy in a weirdly ineffectual attempt to bind with science. Since we're all composed of matter and energy, doesn't that scientific principle lend credibility to belief in eternal life? Mills replied more patiently and politely than I would have, for what the interviewer was saying, translated into English, was no more than, when we die, none of the atoms of our body and none of the energy are lost. Therefore, we are immortal. Even I, with my long experience, have never encountered wishful thinking as silly as that. I have, however, met many of the wonderful proofs collected at website godlessgeeks.com. You can see it there. A richly comic-numbered list of over 300 proofs of God's existence. Here's a hilarious half dozen, beginning with proof number 36. Argument from incomplete devastation. A plane crashed, killing 143 passengers and crew, but one child survived with only third degree burns. Therefore, God exists. 37. Argument from possible worlds. If things had been different, then things would be different. That would be bad. Therefore, God exists. Argument from sheer will. I do believe in God. I do believe in God. I do believe in God. Therefore, God exists. Argument from non-belief. The majority of the world's population are non-believers in Christianity. This is just what Satan intended. Therefore, God exists. Argument from post-death experience. Person X died an atheist. He now realizes his mistake. Therefore, God exists. Argument from emotional blackmail. God loves you. How could you be so heartless as to not believe in him? Therefore, God exists.
And that's the end of the section. He just kind of trails off with a bunch of irrelevant parallel arguments that don't engage Anselm's ontological argument.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. So this section kind of fizzles out. I admit that the arguments from Godless Geeks are funny, although they're not all entirely wrong. I mean, like argument 40, the argument from post-death experience. Okay. Premise 1, person X died an atheist. Premise 2, he, person X, now realizes his mistake. Okay. So he realizes he was mistaken to die an atheist. Well, that would support the existence of God. So if you could verify the premises, the argument actually would work. So one, as the 20th century parapsychologist Gertrude Schmeidler said, the survival of death hypothesis is the one hypothesis that we'll know for sure when we actually die. So if you die an atheist and you wake up in the afterlife and meet God and conclude you were wrong, you would have reason to believe in God at that point. So while they're amusing, and not practical from a this worldly point of view, they're not entirely worthless if you are not limited to just this life.
Yeah. I had to get my composure.
Sure.
That was
always in the last place you look.
That was wild. I was not expecting him to go off on that tangent.
I know, he just kind of disintegrates.
In response to the ontological argument. I mean, what? What did that have to do with the ontological argument? Okay, so like we started this subsection. We're about to wrap up. We started this subsection kind of explaining. I mean, Jimmy, you said that you're a little bit more open to the success of the argument. I'm not really convinced that it's a successful argument. I mean, and that's the thing about natural theology and Christianity and apologetics. Like, you don't have to, as a Christian, accept that these arguments are sound. Anyone, like Jimmy, you're more skeptical of the Kalam, for example, than I am. And
well,
you don't
I'm
have
skeptical of certain versions of the Kalam.
Okay,
but I accept the Kalam.
Yeah, well, the just the point is that you don't have to accept these arguments just because you're a Christian, right? And I think we should be evaluating these arguments as honestly as we can. The responses to the ontological argument that are most compelling are just not present here at all.
Yeah, he didn't raise the most perfect island objection, and that's the most famous one there is. So
and he also mentions Guanillo, and he's the one who raised it. So it's like, what? You mentioned the guy, but you didn't mention his argument or his response.
Yeah.
Weird.
And just for people who may be wondering, so the objection is, so imagine the most perfect island. It's got everything you want in an island. The tropical climate is awesome. It's got a resort on it. The resort is awesome. It's the best island ever. Does it exist in reality? Well, okay, if it doesn't exist in reality, then it's not as perfect as if it really did exist in reality. Therefore, the most perfect island must exist. And it doesn't. And so consequently, Ganillo would say your argument, Anselm, doesn't work. And so that's, like a key objection that's been there right from the beginning. And Dawkins doesn't even go into that.
Yeah. It's really weird. That one I'm not too convinced by, because in that case it just seems obvious that a most perfect island is not possible. Whereas when you're thinking about God's existence, that does seem like a compossible set of attributes that you could put together. But with an island, you could always add one more palm tree, you could always add one more swimming pool, you could always add one more beautiful beach, and so you can't really there's no maximum there. Whereas in the case of God, you can set a maximum on these attributes, and then you can ask the question, are they all compossible with each other? And lots of ink has been spilled on that question. But that's not really an objection that I take too seriously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't either for the reason that you mentioned, or because if you load up the island with good making qualities, it's going to become indistinguishable from God.
Mm. Or eventually, like it could be that you come up with you add so much stuff that eventually just becomes like not that great of an island. But then the other question would be, would the greatest island need to exist necessarily? And I don't know that that's true. But that's not really the most serious objection to the argument, though it is one that I think you ought to sort of work through as you're thinking about this argument. But the one that's like got me where I'm basically very skeptical of the argument these days is what's called the reverse modal ontological argument. So the modal ontological argument, as I was mentioning earlier, kind of draws on the notion of possibility. So it's like you can kind of summarize the modal version of the argument like this, and Dawkins doesn't include this, which is anyway. So, but this is the way that you summarize it. Premise 1: it's possible that God exists. Premise 2: if it's possible that God exists, then God exists. Premise 3: the conclusion just follows: God exists. So that's a way to sort of summarize the modal ontological argument. You could even think of Plantinga's version as supporting the second premise. If it's possible that God exists, then God exists. So you could use Plantinga's version as a sort of support of that second premise, but really all of the action is going to take place on premise 1. Is it possible that God exists? And the notion of possibility there is actually really important. That's getting to some deeper waters, some deeper philosophy. But back to this objection, the reverse modal ontological argument. Atheist Graham Oppie and others have raised what I think is a very good objection to the modal ontological argument that basically just reverses that possibility premise. So the possibility premise is, again, in the modal ontological argument, it's possible that God exists. The reverse says it's possible that God does not exist. And then premise 2 in the reverse, if it's possible that God does not exist, then God does not exist. Conclusion: God does not exist. And so you basically have these two competing arguments. You've got the modal ontological argument, you've got the reverse modal ontological argument, and then you got to decide like which of those possibility premises is more likely or more probable. And at that point, like to me, you're just, in order to motivate that one of those possibility premises is true, you're going to appeal to other phenomena, other arguments, and that's going to make it more likely you think God is possible, or you think it's more likely that God is not possible given some, problem of evil or something else. So that's why I'm not really convinced that this argument is that great of an argument or that persuasive of an argument, because I think ultimately what you're going to do is then appeal to other arguments and just talk about those arguments instead. Like you don't have to really get the ontological argument involved here. That's my reason for being skeptical. I don't know what Dawkins was doing there in his book, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, fundamentally, it seems like what Dawkins has done in these first two sections is essentially, if I were to summarize it in a single sentence, I would say Richard Dawkins picks on 1,000-year-old arguments while ignoring the work that's been done on those arguments in the last 1,000 years, and then trails off into irrelevance.
Sorry, I wasn't expecting that to make me laugh so much. But
glad it did.
That's exactly what that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. Oof.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and close out the show. Oh, we should also mention that
before we go, we need to remind folks about we do need your support. Like we said, we are 3/4 of the way to our overall goal. A little bit more than 3/4 of the way to our goal. We need another $900 a month, which just 28 people donating at the $25 a month level would get us there, or 14 people donating at the $50 a month level would get us there. Everyone who contributes any amount will get the very valuable PDF about gospel reliability. If you're able to give at the $25 a month level, you get Pat Flynn's book, The Best Argument for God, which has gotten loads and loads of praise. And if you're able to give at the $50 a month level, you'll also, in addition to the book and the PDF, you'll also get the Shroud of Turin statue of Jesus, which is, it's I want to say it's bronze, but Cameron,
made of real steel, real bronze. Yeah.
Steel and bronze. And so it's going to be steel on the inside, bronze on the outside. And these are a unique item. They are not available elsewhere. They're a great devotional item. So if you have a devotion to the Shroud of Turin, this is a great way to express that. And we just need to hear from you today. You can go to patreon.com/Capturing Christianity. You can also go to DonorBox, and those addresses are down in the description below. So please, if you see value in what Capturing Christianity is doing, please do support it and help it continue to grow and thrive. Cameron has lots of plans. He shared some of those with me, and they sound really exciting. So if you want to see the channel continue to grow and flourish and continue the valuable work that it's doing, which is not what you find on every apologetics channel, to be frank, then please do help us out and help us continue. Thank you so much, and God bless you.
Thank you guys so much. Okay, let's maybe talk, because we only got through chapter 3, the first 2 subsections. So what are our plans to finish this out? I'm happy to do it on my channel. Mm-hmm. We can do some of it on your channel. Maybe we can discuss this after the fact, but I would like to get through some more of this. So
sure.
And audience, so, another thing I wanted to mention to the audience is, let me know, guys, if you enjoyed this, if you'd like us to see us sort of tag team and look at other books. I'd love to do more of this. I think this was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this was just so folks will be aware of kind of the headspace we were in for this. You had proposed, Cameron, that we do dialogues, perhaps alternating them between your channel and mine, where we read through this book or other books. I proposed we call it the Atheist Book Club. And I actually, given the way this one worked today, you could also call it Atheist Bedtime Stories. But either the Atheist Book Club or Atheist Bedtime Stories, I think both of those would be great. And so, yeah, if folks would like to see us do more of this, by all means, let us know.
Yep, and we'll try to schedule these as often as our schedules allow. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. This was a lot more fun than I was anticipating, and hopefully you got something out of this. I mean, kind of like we said at the beginning of this, like the Richard Dawkins book is not really the definitive last word on the existence of God, but it is nevertheless important. It's a bestseller, so I think it is important to kind of get through it, work through it, and share some thoughts on it.
It's influenced a lot of people and convinced a lot of people of atheism, so it's worth talking about.
Yeah. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention that I don't know why I haven't mentioned this yet is that there are some newer resources I wanted to highlight for you guys. I mean, the book that we're giving away for this fundraiser is also probably really an important contribution to this, but there are some other resources that I wanted to highlight for you guys. Let me put myself full screen so you can see. So this one is called Natural Theology. The Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, which was edited by William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland. And in this one, they have these essays that are about 70 pages long, something like that, on different arguments for the existence of God. Let me see if I can pull up the contents here. Yeah, so they've got the Leibnizian cosmological argument, which is the argument from contingency by Alex Proust. The Kalams by William Lane Craig and James Sinclair. Teleological argument by Robin Collins. The argument from consciousness, Moreland. The argument from reason, Victor Raper. The moral argument, Mark D. Linville. The argument from evil, Stuart Getz. The argument from religious experience, Kai-Man Kwan. Ontological argument, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to pull this up and talk to you guys about it, is because this is another contribution that sort of broadened the dialectic of the ontological argument from Madel, Robert E. Madel. And that one is in, again, the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. And then the last chapter in this one is the argument from miracles, a cumulative case for the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And that one is by Timothy McGrew and Lydia McGrew. So this one, if you're going to buy a book on apologetics or philosophy of religion, you want to know what are some of the best arguments that can be defended in defense of God's existence, pick this one up. It was published in 2012. So fairly recent. It came after the God Delusion. I don't know if it was necessarily a response to it, but some of these articles, you can actually search for them online, and some of them are available for free. For example, I know that Tim and Lydia McGrew's article is available online for free. Alex Proust's article in here is available online for free, and then Robin Collins's as well. But the book itself, if you like physical copies and stuff, it's also worth getting and keeping in your library and referencing every now and then. I did reference it actually in in preparation for this show. And then another one I just want to highlight quickly before we wrap up is this one that was edited by Trent Doherty and Jerry Walls, called 24 or so Arguments for God's Existence, for God. And this one is actually based on Alvin Plantinga's list that he provided a few years ago on, he basically created this paper and was talking about a bunch of different arguments for the existence of God. And so Jerry Walls and Trent Doherty contacted a bunch of philosophers who then wrote essays defending each of those lines. And there's 24 or so of these essays defending with updated arguments the existence of God. So this one I think is also worth picking up. And some of the articles in here are very, very good. So those two resources, if you guys are interested in learning more about philosophy of religion, the arguments for the existence of God, I definitely would recommend picking these resources up. So hopefully you do and get something out of it. Jimmy, is there anything you'd like to say before we close out?
No, I think that's it. I had a great time today. I hope the viewers did as well, and I look forward to hearing what they have to say.
Oh, also let me know what you think about the book cam. Is it worth it? Should I keep it? Should I get rid of it?
The book cam is now, of course, you could just buy Kindle and then share your screen. So that's another option for you. But,
Jimmy.
But I love the name book cam, especially given that your name is Cameron. I mean, I can just imagine sportscasters going, okay, Cameron, let's go to the book cam.
Yeah, actually, I don't know what the legality stuff is with sharing Kindle like that. I don't know if.
Oh, no, it's fair use, and it's for education.
Oh, really? Okay.
It's a transformative purpose. You're not reading in a single video like this. You're not reading the whole book. So it's a very limited amount of a much longer work presented for educational and purposes and critique purposes. That's totally fair use.
Okay. Good idea. All right, I'll think about it, and then we could have our faces on the screen too. Let me know what you guys think in the comments if you guys are still watching this. Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you later. Let me know what you thought. All right, see you guys later. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?